On the Jicarilla Apache Reservation in northern New Mexico sits the small community of Dulce. Since the late 1970s, it's become a landmark in the strange world of UFO conspiracies, up there with the likes of Area 51 thanks to horrifying tales of alien bases underneath Mount Archuleta. But the real story of Dulce has its roots in the cattle mutilation wave of the mid to late 1970s.
People tell me Dulce wasn't always a center for supernatural activity, but then sometime in the 70s, things changed. That's when cows started turning up mutilated.
In the first part of this two-part series on the origins of the Dulce conspiracy, I covered the original mutilations from the mid to late 1970s. If you haven't watched it already, then I'd recommend going back and doing so, because this part is going to cover some of the explanations and theories for the highly strange harvest that appeared to be plaguing this small community in northern New Mexico. This series is brought to you by viewer support on Patreon. You can sign up for as little as £1 a month, which gives you early access to videos and helps to fund the research and creation of these documentaries. Go to the link in the description or the pinned comment and sign up today. If you mention the words black helicopter to someone, you're most likely going to be met with confusion or derision. Over the years, stories of people spotting unmarked and deathly quiet helicopters have been conflated with New World Order flavoured conspiracies and militia movements. If you believed in them, then you're a crank and not to be trusted. But these sightings of black helicopters have their origins in the cattle mutilation phenomena, with many ranchers purporting to see them either before or after an unexplained livestock death. So, were all of them lying, or was there really something strange in the sky? In the 1960s, the Hughes Tool Aircraft Division sold a bunch of helicopters to the city of Los Angeles, which were then flown around at low altitude, annoying the hell out of just about everyone. The city got a bunch of complaints about them, so they went back to the company and said, you either make these things quieter or you give us our bloody money back. Not wanting to lose out, the company began working on a way to reduce the noise in the helicopters, and they just so happened to attract the attention of the Advanced Research Projects Agency, now known as DARPA, who conveniently were on the prowl for contractors to make quieter aircraft. What a coincidence! What they created was dubbed the Quiet One, and it had been modified so much that it barely sounded like a regular helicopter. They began testing the aircraft in the early 1970s at the infamous Area 51 and other locations in California. Naturally, the CIA were interested, ultimately buying 2 of them, and in December 1972, the Quiet One took its first flight as part of Air America, the CIA's very own airline and former employer of John Lear, a man who we'll come to be very familiar with in future episodes. According to available records, one of the helicopters was used as part of a wiretap mission in Vietnam, and the other was destroyed. The remaining helicopter was transferred to the Pacific Corporation, which was a CIA holding company that included Air America amongst its affiliates. According to Fletcher Prouty,
Air America had the capability to maintain aircraft of all kinds, and more than that, it could make parts for most of its own aircraft.
He also said that Air America could
build complete aircraft in order that it could create a totally sanitized airplane with no serial numbers.
And although he wasn't specifically referring to the Quiet One, there's a strong argument to be made that once CIA's Air America got hold of the technology, they could duplicate it and create their own totally sanitized versions. So essentially, they could have an entire fleet of stealthy black helicopters making a mere murmur in the sky, with nobody being any wiser. It's important to keep the timing in mind too. This was an aircraft that was being flown in the early 1970s, just a few years before the New Mexico mutilation wave got going. It's also around the same era as Lockheed's Hopeless Diamond, which would later make way for the F-117A stealth aircraft. This is a time period where stealth technology was being actively experimented with by the military. Is it really that out there to think that cattle ranchers were actually seeing almost silent helicopters in the sky? And is it too credulous to believe that these aircraft were somehow involved in these highly strange livestock deaths? I would argue no on both counts, even though I do feel skeptical about so much of the cattle mutilation phenomena. So, if we say for a moment that secret helicopters were really involved, it naturally leads us to a simple but incredibly important question.
Why? 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 Why?
After killing over 200,000 people in Japan in August 1945, the United States made the bold decision to utilize the power of the atomic age to, in their own words, promote world peace, improve the public welfare, and strengthen free competition in private enterprise.
The United States would seek more than the mere reduction or elimination of atomic materials for military purposes. It is not enough to take this weapon out of the hands of the soldiers. It must be put into the hands of those who will know how to strip its military casing and adapt it to the arts of peace.
They achieved this lofty goal by, among other things, partnering with Quaker Oats to feed disabled children radioactive oatmeal, exposing prisoners at Washington State Penitentiary to extreme levels of X-ray radiation, and by detonating 35 nuclear warheads as part of Operation Plowshare.
He sees the potentials and he sees the problems. To investigate both and to develop the technology that will turn potentials into realities, the United States is conducting, for the benefit of all nations, a program it calls Plowshare.
On December 10th, 1967, just a few months after the infamous Snippy the horse was found mutilated in the San Luis Valley, the Atomic Energy Commission delivered an early Christmas present to the residents of northern New Mexico by detonating a 26-kiloton nuclear device to create an underground gas reservoir in the Carson National Forest.
Gasbuggy was one of several gas stimulation experiments the Plowshare program performed. Geologists were aware of the presence of natural gas in very tight geologic formations. It couldn't be accessed or extracted economically with conventional methods. So the idea was put forth that we'll sink a shaft into this formation, we'll lower a nuclear device and detonate it and use that power to fracture the gas-bearing rock, allowing an increased flow back into the chimney area, the shaft area, and we can then pipe the natural gas off.
The US has a long and sordid history of conducting nuclear testing directly next to Native American reservations, with the western Shoshone Nation of Nevada being some of the hardest hit by the fallout. The Gasbuggy detonation took place on the doorstep of the Jicarilla Apache Reservation, around 25 miles from Dulce, and it wasn't a successful venture. The gas was deemed to be too radioactive, and the Public Health Service found that the radioactivity in vegetation downwind from Gasbuggy was increased by 10 times. Despite the gas being too radioactive for usage, it was vented or flared off into the atmosphere, and that wasn't all. In his book Dulce Base, Greg Valdez writes that between 1967 and 2003, there was a leak of radioactive material into water around the well site, and that to this day, many records on Operation Gasbuggy remain classified. If large amounts of nuclear fallout were created from the underground explosions, what better way to monitor the local area than to target a local herd, perhaps the one that belonged to Manuel Gomez. The Atomic Energy Commission were no strangers to testing on cattle. They had their own herd that grazed on the Nevada test site from the late 1950s as part of their animal investigation program. In 1984, the Environmental Protection Agency released a report on the investigation, and it contained some very interesting tidbits, most notably the admission that domestic and wild animals were frequently sampled pre- and post-detonation at the sites of special nuclear projects, including Gasbuggy. They went on to say that animals were sampled in downwind areas from other Plowshare cratering events, and that special ad hoc investigations were conducted. They don't go into detail on what these ad hoc investigations were, so it's hard to ascertain exactly what they entailed and exactly where they took place. While it's not exactly smoking gun evidence, it does stand as proof of animal testing in northern New Mexico, and it also offers a much more plausible explanation for the cattle mutilations and strange aircraft that plagued Dulce than grey aliens and UFOs. Now, of course, debunkers will be quick to point out that Gasbuggy is a fair few miles from Dulce, but I would argue that if you're trying to ascertain the effects of potential nuclear fallout in the surrounding community, reality, then it makes sense to go a little further afield. They'll also say things like, why don't the government just buy their own cattle and do their own experiments? And, in the case of the Nevada test site, we know that they did. However, if you want to monitor animals that will eventually make their way into the food supply chain, then you again might want to look a little further afield from your own herd of cattle. To me, it makes sense to target animals that will eventually end up on a dinner plate. That way, you're going to have a much clearer idea of how irradiated the beef supply is. And you can also keep an eye out for any number of pesky diseases. But to be clear, it's just a theory, albeit one that feels incredibly believable, given what we know about not only the secrecy of certain organisations, but a long-standing history of covering up the effects of deadly radiation. By the end of the 1970s, UFOs and the cattle mutilation phenomena had become increasingly entwined, and the continued sightings of strange lights in the sky only made investigating terrestrial explanations more difficult. Dulce was no exception. On the 7th of April 1979, two officers from the Jicarilla Tribal Police and Gabe Valdez would come face to face with one of the mystery craft. Snooping around the back roads of Dulce with their lights turned off was a regular Saturday night practice for the Jicarilla Tribal Police. The two officers were hoping to bust partying teenagers that had decided to break the 1 AM curfew. But instead of finding drunken kids, they came across a silent aircraft that was shining a floodlight directly onto a herd of cattle owned by none other than Manuel Gomez. Was this it? The moment that they were going to finally catch the mutilators in the act? According to a news report, the officers turned off their car engine and sat there watching the near silent aircraft for around 10 minutes. They said that it didn't move, that it just hovered there above the cows. So naturally, they radioed for Gabe Valdez, but as soon as they did, the aircraft decided to move.
It went up the air a little ways. It was moving towards us. Then it went by. It was not moving fast. It flew straight up and then flew north, northwest. We could see 3 different lights: red, white, and green. And it was shiny underneath.
At this point, Gabe Valdez was around 4 miles away, but his voice soon came over the radio, telling the officers that he could see the aircraft and that it was moving in the direction of the nearby city of Farmington. According to a write-up in the Rio Grande Sun, the FAA managed to track the aircraft on a radar screen, and they claimed that it was travelling around 300 miles per hour at an altitude of 5,300 feet. So what the hell was it? Major Ben Orrell of the nearby Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque made a statement to the Rio Grande Sun, questioning the validity of the sighting. He said that there wasn't a helicopter in existence that flew 300 miles an hour, and certainly not one in Kirtland's inventory. He went on to say that he was doubtful that it was even a helicopter, and claimed that the reported sighting was not logical. That same news report then mentions a military source that spoke of a helicopter that was used in Vietnam, an obvious reference to the Quiet One, but Major Orrell rebutted the allegations, saying that he knew of no helicopter with sophisticated muffling equipment. I mean, of course the man from Kirtland Air Force Base would say that. We know that one existed, and sure, you could say that maybe he didn't know about it, but I think it's interesting that someone from Kirtland would be giving statements like that to the press, considering the fact that just a few months later, the very same Air Force Base would begin conducting a psychological operation against UFO researchers, flooding the field with disinformation that still gets repeated to this day.
Rebel, rebel, put on your dress. Rebel, rebel, your face is a mess.
Psychological warfare and societal programming was another theory put forward by mutilation researchers, and again it has historical significance. Superstition and belief in the paranormal has long been exploited by intelligence agencies and the military, from Operation Wandering Soul in Vietnam to General Lansdale's fake vampire attacks in the Philippines. In his series on Bosco Nedeljkovic, another strange figure connected to UFO PSYOPS, writer and researcher Tanner Boyle notes,
both of these operations weaponized local supernatural folklore, superstitions, and cultural beliefs. Other purported psychological operations of the time period, albeit across the globe, also made use of belief in the paranormal, or at least inadvertently created paranormal narratives that would stick around.
Operation Wandering Soul and the fake vampire attacks are just two operations that exploited folklore and superstitions as part of a psychological warfare campaign. And I don't think anyone is naive enough to think that they know the full scale of military and intelligence PSYOPs, many of which I'm sure are unfolding as I speak.
Call it spacecraft if you will.
On the forum Something Awful, a poster named Atrocious Joe highlighted a part of Christopher O'Brien's book Stalking the Herd, where he writes about astronomer Frank Drake and a strange report from his time in Puerto Rico in the 1960s. According to Drake, a guard at the Arecibo Radio Telescope complex where he was based had claimed to have seen what he believed to be a vampire, and just 48 hours later, a cow on a nearby farm was found dead, with all of the blood drained from its body. To combat the fear amongst his guards, he began increasing the amount of garlic in the food prepared on the complex, and Atrocious Joe notes that he legitimated the story with his actions. He didn't combat the superstition, he reinforced it. Drake would go on to say, on the very same page, that they then faced a more palpable threat from a group of radical political activists, and that he was in regular communication with an FBI agent who would warn him of impending attacks. Now, could it be that this supposed vampire sighting, and a cow supposedly drained of blood, were attempts to whip up hysteria amongst the guards that could then be exploited further? Who's to say that the cattle mutilation phenomena in the United States wasn't exploited as part of an intricate psychological operation, one designed to send a certain section of the population spiraling into dangerous levels of paranoia and fear?
It affects the segment of the population that is probably the more well-armed with firearms than any other section of the population. They also are the most radical right-wing section of the population, ranchers and farmers. What a perfect way to do societal programming, by keeping them in a place of fear, by using this terror tactic to keep them in their place.
The mid-70s saw the publishing of the Church Committee's report into intelligence agency abuses. They found that the domestic activities of the intelligence community infringed on the constitutional rights of American citizens, and that's putting it lightly. In this era, the wider public discovered the existence of programs like MKUltra, Operation Chaos, and COINTELPRO, although the full extent of those programs is still very much unknown. These revelations led to a well-deserved mistrust of the intelligence agencies and the government at large. Distrust had been growing amongst ranchers, thanks to turbulent economic conditions and incidents like the Skull Valley sheep kill, where the US Army decided to spray a nerve agent out of an aircraft that led to the deaths of around 6,000 sheep. In the 70s, a series of environmental laws were passed by the federal government to protect public lands. They contained restrictions on cattle grazing, which led to anger from the ranching community and ultimately set the stage for what became known as the Sagebrush Rebellion. Michael J. Goldman writes in his paper Wave of Mutilation,
"The hostility small ranchers showed toward the federal government during the mutilation scare presaged and helped provide the impetus for events such as the Sagebrush Rebellion."
Well, the Sagebrush Rebellion, as I know it, is simply a concern from the using public, especially the livestock industry, with having to accept bureaucratic mandates on public land that they use as a part of their operations. And they, being a very independent sort of people, prefer not to have to answer to anyone with regard to their management decisions. Simply put, they would prefer to own that land, and it was an initiative that was designed to, first of all, to acquire those lands for private ownership.
Of course, this dispute between ranchers and the government was stoked by oil and gas companies that saw an opportunity to gain unfettered access to public lands.
Well, it turned out the Sagebrush Rebellion, including the pitchforks, which they all used to wave on television, was bought and paid for by the big extractive companies.
The Sagebrush Rebellion became a facade for other interests working behind the scenes to gain access to the resources on public land.
At the same time, there was this massive rush by the oil and gas companies to open public lands.
Interior Secretary James Watt allowed the land to be leased at fire sale prices. The low prices allowed coal companies to make windfall profits.
The growing dissatisfaction among many ranchers concerning government intrusiveness and restrictive policies, such as environment conservation and tight regulations regarding public land use, found a release in the response to the mutilation episode, with ranchers venting their frustrations by taking direct aim at the federal government.
In his book Messengers of Deception, Jacques Vallée argues that it's not the phenomenon itself, but the belief it has created, which is then manipulated by human groups with their own objectives.
Or could it be manipulated purposely by people who have the technology to simulate UFO sightings? And people say, well, of course not. Who would do a thing like that? Well, I would remind you that during the Watergate investigation, it was discovered that there was a plan originated in the White House to surface a submarine off the coast of Cuba and paint the second coming of Christ over the island of Cuba using holograms, which is well within our technology today. The idea was that since there is a large Catholic population in Cuba, they would be so upset by this vision that this would saturate the communication channels, the telephone system in Cuba, long enough for an invasion to take place.
How interesting. I've never heard of that.
Well, I think that's a classic in psychological warfare, but that kind of manipulation is well understood, and I have personally investigated several apparently genuine UFO cases where there was, in fact, manipulation. My conclusion, the conclusion of scientists working with me, was that there was, in fact, a manipulation taking place, and that it was not a hoax on the part of the witnesses, but a hoax on the part of somebody much better organized.
Although Vallée was talking specifically about belief in UFOs, I think the same could easily be applied to cattle mutilations, especially given how entangled the two became. Who's to say that the volatile relationship between the government and ranchers wasn't manipulated by an outside source, one that had an invested interest in gaining access to public land, and saw a way to do it by stoking theories of a vast government conspiracy involving mutilated cattle. On the other hand, if we entertain the notion of UFO phenomena being exploited by military and intelligence agencies, then surely we should consider some cattle mutilations in the same vein. It only takes one spark to start a fire, or one dead cow to start a wave of hysteria about aliens coming down and eating our precious livestock. And those kinds of beliefs can be incredibly useful if you want to divert attention away from, say, covert environmental testing. When it comes to belief in strange phenomena, some people only need a small amount of nudging in the right direction. Once they begin to accept that what they're experiencing is extraterrestrial, they can be incredibly useful in spreading that message far and wide. Before he entered the world of politics, New Mexican Senator Harrison Schmitt had been part of Apollo 17, the last of the Apollo missions, becoming the 12th person to step foot on the moon.
I came to Albuquerque today to tell you something that I now realize is absolutely unnecessary to tell you, and that was how lucky you are to have a senator like Jack Schmitt. You already know that.
But by the end of 1978, he'd taken a giant leap into the cattle mutilation mystery, making headlines for calling upon the Justice Department to investigate. He was concerned with what he said appeared to be a continued pattern of organised interstate criminal activity, and said that the investigation needed to zero in on the problem and follow through any and all substantial leads. Assistant Attorney General Philip Heyman forwarded correspondence from Schmitt to the FBI in early 1979, noting that animals were being mutilated in a manner that could indicate that it was performed as part of a ritual or ceremony, and that the report of mutilations occurring on indigenous reservations was the first indication that federal law may have been violated. Work began on planning a conference. It was to be held on April 20th at the Albuquerque Public Library. Little did they know that this meeting of the minds would serve as the turning point in the Dulce mythos. Around 180 people showed up at 9 a.m. that morning, eager to hear theories around who the mutilators were and how to stop them. The dizzying array of speakers, and some of their more unconventional ideas, led one local reporter to dub the conference the strangest collection of weirdos ever assembled in New Mexico. Don't know about you, that sounds like my kind of party. I wish I'd been there. It attracted a wide variety of attendees too. There were your cattle mutilation investigators, ufologists, law enforcement, the news media, and, most likely, people like me who enjoy being privy to all manner of strangeness.
Every UFO and mutilation kook in the world was there. They were like a bunch of wild Einsteins, but with no common sense.
The senator opened the conference by saying that he wanted to define the scope of the mutilation problem and what the basis would be for federal assistance. He introduced the first speaker, cattle mutilation researcher David Perkins, who I mentioned in my previous video on Snippy the Horse.
I put out a paper back in those days called Proximity Relationships, and it got some news play, and the headline was "Spokesman Says Mutilations are Test Animals for Radiation," or something like that. That was me. So I spent a long time, and I had this map, which I actually took to the Schmidt conference, which was this big board with a map of the US and Canada, and I had pins in it for all the mutilations.
Now, UFOs weren't the sole focus of the proceedings, and many researchers, Perkins included, put forward strong evidence and arguments for why the mutilations deserved further research, evidence which continually pointed to human involvement instead of aliens. Tom Adams, a researcher from Texas who published the newsletter Stigmata, presented his evidence on the presence of unidentified helicopters at mutilation sites. There was Dr. Peter Van Arsdale from the University of Denver, who urged investigators to discount theories about satanic cults and little green men. And Gabe Valdez and Manuel Gomez were there, relaying the mutilations that had been plaguing Dulce, putting an emphasis on the mental anguish that it had caused the Gomez family, dubbing the whole thing Cattlegate. But then there were people like James J. Hurtak, who was a good buddy of Andrea Puharich, connected to the Stanford Research Institute, the Council of Nine, and he was one of the first people to push the idea of a face on Mars. And that's barely touching the surface of that guy. According to Mute Evidence, he addressed himself to the ancient legends of visitation to the Earth by sky people, and perhaps his appearance at the conference was what inspired Tom Adams to write in the fall edition of Stigmata.
Other, paranoid or reasonably justified, observers have proposed that the conference was designed to embarrass the sincere and legitimate mutilation investigators by sprinkling the meeting with bizarre, dubiously relevant presentations and information. This would make it easier for the media and the public to reject the whole matter by throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
How UFO researcher Paul Bennewitz came to be a target of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations is still a matter of speculation, but many point towards his attendance at the Schmidt conference. His name appears on a list of attendees, and that's where it's alleged that he met Gabe Valdez for the first time and became embroiled in the strange goings-on at Dulce.
It had been expressed, I think, that he had had an interest in the subject of UFOs and whatnot going back for a long time before that, which, not that that's a surprise, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was the idea that by the time the cattle mutilation phenomena began to come out, and it happened to be a few hours from his neck of the woods, it made it convenient for him to pursue that, that idea of it, especially with the UFO sightings or lights being reported. And almost certainly that's what led him to drive up to the area and attend the CBI conference. I don't recall exactly where it was at the time, but he attended it, and apparently that was perhaps where he met Gabe Valdez, and I'm sure Gabe Valdez's name was known to just about everybody involved at the time.
It was Paul's meeting with Gabe Valdez that would eventually lead to the stories of an underground base at Dulce.
Apparently, it was shortly after that, or having met Gabe Valdez, that he had arranged to do a drive, I guess a nighttime drive around, the patrol or whatever Gabe Valdez was doing. And Paul went up there to the area where Gabe was stationed in the Dulce area and rode around with him on a night, on one of his night patrols. And apparently saw some unusual things. I don't recall there was a clear description of exactly what was seen, but light, strange things that certainly piqued Paul's interest.
Up until this point, there had just been a series of mutilations and strange events, but things were about to take a much darker and sinister turn when Bennewitz took to his roof towards the end of 1979 and began photographing strange lights above Kirtland Air Force Base.
I was just wondering, when did you first become aware of him? Because some people have speculated that he would have been, again, this is just what I've read in books, that he was somehow kind of targeted or discovered at the cattle mutilation conference that he went to in April 1979. So when did you become aware of him?
I became aware of him when he came to the Air Force,
right,
and told the Air Force that he was photographing strange objects over Kirtland Air Force Base.
According to Adam Go-Rightly's sources Spooks and Kooks, the first reference to an underground alien war at Dulce can be traced back to a letter that Bennewitz sent to Senator Pete Domenici in 1981.
Although Bennewitz didn't implicitly state that there was an actual battle between humans and aliens at Dulce, his comments about some type of conflict, or of the humans abandoning the base, appeared to have been enough to plant the seed that later blossomed into a full-scale Dulce firefight.
The story of Paul Bennewitz and the disinformation campaign that was mounted against him will be explored in full in a later part of this series, but it's important to mention now because his involvement in the cattle mutilation phenomena was what drew him to Dulce in the first place. The hysteria was at an all-time high. Theories of aliens, cults, and covert government operations were being floated around all over the place. Something needed to be done. Somebody needed to investigate. 4 days after the conference, the 1st District Attorney's Office in New Mexico was awarded a $50,000 grant to investigate the mutilations. And guess who they chose to head it up? None other than a retired federal agent named Kenneth Rommel, who'd been nicknamed the Desert Fox and had spent 28 years with the FBI. His obituary states that he joined the FBI in 1951 and that his career took him to Chicago, New York, and Puerto Rico, where he worked in counter-espionage. And although I can't prove it for sure, he could well have been involved in COINTELPRO, which targeted independence groups like the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, which is interesting given the strange vampire story that I relayed earlier, which then seemed to give way to warnings from an FBI agent about radical political groups. If the goal was to raise the hackles of the cattle mutologists and have the investigation dogged with allegations of a cover-up from the very beginning, then they definitely chose the right guy. Rumours about the investigation's lack of trustworthiness began circulating pretty much as soon as it was announced. But here's the weird thing. The mutilations appeared to have stopped just as the whole thing got started. A strange coincidence? Or something more sinister? I'm not sure if we'll ever know, but word was travelling fast on the mutology grapevine that Kenneth Rommel was planning to defame independent investigators and that his sole interest was dismissing the phenomena. By the time the almost 300-page report came out in June 1980, Rommel was enemy number one, a debunker determined to brush the high strangeness under the carpet and throw the researchers under the bus. Let me tell you, the cattle mutilation investigators were pissed about it. Greg Valdez labelled it an armchair investigation. Linda Moulton Howe called it an obvious paid-for whitewash that didn't even deal with the real cases. And Howard Burgess went as far as to write to the district attorney.
I was under the impression that Ken Rommel was investigating the cattle mutilations until I saw his book. I suddenly realized that he was doing humorous Western fiction. It might even be better than the last Peanuts book. If Ken had attacked the problem instead of people, he might have produced some interesting non-fiction.
Now, Burgess might have had a good reason for being especially angry at the report. Rommel didn't pull any punches, and he dragged Burgess pretty hard. He tore into pretty much all of his theories, and for some of them he provided seemingly reasonable explanations. Take the flakes from the Taos UFO, for example. Rommel claims that he received a small amount to run his own tests, and the results were pretty damning.
The specimen was identified as white enamel paint, typical of an acrylic latex emulsion type exterior house paint. In a letter dated April 9, 1980, I informed Burgess of the results of the FBI examination and suggested that he might wish to confirm these findings with any scientific laboratory of his choice. On June 12, 1980, he advised me that he has not done so.
The writers of Mute Evidence urged Burgess to retest the flakes, offering to arrange it themselves, but Burgess refused. Could it be that this supposed evidence from a UFO was nothing more than regular household paint? And if it was, who was responsible for planting it there? Surely it would have had to have been Howard Burgess, considering that he was the one that travelled to Taos to collect the material in the first place. In Mute Evidence, the writers point out that Rommel had slowly, and with thorough documentation every inch of the way, pointed out Burgess's phony posturing as a theorist and authority on radiation, cattle metabolism and investigation. He had shown, with the help of experts, that Burgess simply did not know what he was talking about. Rommel also took aim at the theory that the mutilators were specifically targeting the lymphatic system on the animals. He wrote that these were the same parts that were commonly eaten by predators and scavengers. And although I have a tendency to agree, I also think that in some cases there's clear evidence of human involvement. Not everything can be debunked, and Rommel's report is far from perfect. There's also the fact that he was a former federal agent himself. He's not exactly independent. Although the writers of Mute Evidence gave credit to Rommel for his work, they also made it abundantly clear that Rommel had overreached himself in his report and skipped over cases that required a closer look. He seemed to focus on what he could easily disprove, instead of investigating the more strange and seemingly unexplainable cattle mutilation cases. He was quick to point to diseases like blackleg as being responsible, and he didn't do a great job of disproving the theory that cattle were being marked in advance. In his book Dulce Base, Greg Valdez is keen to point out that Rommel never investigated the mutilations on the Gomez Ranch, and claims that he never visited an actual mutilation site. By the time he came to investigate, the mutilations seemed to have stopped, which again makes you wonder whether it was by design. Ultimately, the report did nothing to dissuade believers. Rommel was just a debunker. He was out to discredit the phenomena instead of investigate, and that made whatever he had to say a moot point. Pardon the pun. By the time the Rommel report came out, the wheels of the Dulce myth had been firmly set in motion. In the eyes of investigators, cows were being picked up and taken somewhere else, but nobody seemed to know where. The release of Linda Moulton Howe's 1980 cult classic documentary A Strange Harvest only added to the noise. And whatever you make of the contents of the documentary itself, it's a phenomenal time capsule with its eerie close-ups on the cored out rear ends of cows and interviews with cops and ranchers, two of which should be familiar by now.
Either it's got to be a highly sophisticated agency that has total secrecy and the money and technology, or something else involved. But as far as an occult group being involved in it, I think it would have been broken a long time ago.
So what's left?
Either government or extraterrestrial.
The strange thing about it is that we have never found any blood on them.
No blood?
No blood, no.
Tracks?
The only tracks that we found on the first one were some tripod tracks, and they formed some like a triangle. I didn't know what to think. It was kind of strange because we had never seen anything like that before.
The documentary also featured Leo Sprinkle, who had been actively involved in the Snippy mutilation case, going so far as to regress the owner of the horse to help relieve her of trauma. While investigating their book Mute Evidence, the writers had uncovered the fact that he was friends with Howard Burgess, and both of them would spend weekends at Burl Lewis's ranch in Colorado. They write that this was the kind of solid connection they'd been looking for. All roads led straight back to the very origin of the mutilation phenomenon as a direct offshoot of the UFO subculture. The UFO psychologist, the retired scientist, and one of the people who had started the UFO cattle mutilation connection were all pals and had been for years. All roads led straight back to Alamosa, Colorado in 1967 and the case of Snippy the horse. The writers of Mute Evidence are also quick to point out that blaming a small group of UFO enthusiasts and amateur investigators for the cattle mutilation phenomenon would be an oversimplification, and I've tried to put forward as many perspectives as possible. While I gravitate more towards theories of covert environmental testing and the exploitation of supernatural beliefs for personal gain, other people are firmly in the camp of extraterrestrials, or high strangeness, or simple predators. Much like the Snippy case, I don't have a satisfying answer for what was going on in Dulce in the 1970s, although I do have my own suspicions. In the next installment, we'll be taking a closer, more critical look at Leo Sprinkle and his involvement in the abduction case of Judy Doherty. Just a few months after hypnotically regressing her, he'd come to find himself embroiled in yet another bizarre abduction case alongside Paul Bennewitz, one that truly laid the groundwork for the myth of an underground base at Dulce. Our journey into the bizarre, disinformation-filled world of 1980s ufology is only just beginning. If you like this video, then make sure to subscribe and consider supporting my Patreon. It's through viewer support that I can continue this research and continue making these documentaries. And with that said, I'll see you next time.
I spoke it to the east and I spoke it